Hey, how's everyone doing? I'm Moy, and welcome back to my shop. Well, I was in need of a spline jig, and I thought it'd be pretty cool if I could make the jig do more than just cut splines. This is what I came up with. The jig will cut splines, but it will also cut tenons on this side, as well as small raised panels like this one. Prior to building the jig, I did do a slight modification on this table saw fence, and if you'd like more information about that, here's the link up here. And you can see I have a pretty inexpensive table saw, but if you've got a decent fence, decent table saw, you're all set. My jig is 8 by 11 inches, and the width of these two center pieces here will depend on the thickness of your fence. Well, stick around and watch me build it. I started by grabbing a piece of 3/4 inch plywood I had laying around the shop. Cut two pieces to 8 by 11 inches, and I also cut two pieces that would make up the center supports of the jig. I cut these two pieces oversized, this way I could come back, sneak up on the cut, and make sure they were exactly the same width as the thickness of my fence. Now I could begin working on the handles. I drilled a couple of 1.25 inch holes on the side panels, and I drew a couple of lines to connect two circles. I simply cut out the lines with my jigsaw and created a handle. Off camera, I did use a trim router to round over the edges of the handle. The spline portion of the jig is pretty straightforward. I took a couple of 2-inch strips, cut one end at 45 degrees, and using a speed square, I laid out the pieces on the side panels, pre-drilled from the back side, and using my new glue bot, I applied some glue, clamped it all up, and drove a couple of 1.25 inch screws. With the spline portion of the jig assembled, I was ready to start joining all my pieces. I wanted to make sure the jig wasn't dragging on the surface of the table saw, and I used a couple of folded up pieces of paper to lift the side panels up off the table saw. I laid everything out. One more time, I was ready for the glue up. Once it was all clamped up, I lifted the entire assembly off my fence and made sure to clean up any glue squeeze out. I then came back and pre-drilled, drove a couple more screws in. A little bit of sanding, and I was ready to apply the coat of paste wax to my fence and the runner portion of the jig. And everything's sliding nicely, so I was ready to move on to the tenon portion of the jig. Again, I used a folded up piece of paper to lift the plywood off the table saw surface, and using a speed square, made sure the vertical piece was precisely 90 degrees to the table saw. Used a couple of clamps, pre-drilled, and drove in a couple of screws. Having two screws in, I made sure the piece was still perfectly square to the table and drove the last two screws in place. I attached an inexpensive toggle clamp from Harbor Freight. And the jig was pretty much done at this point. I grabbed a couple pieces of pine, made a quick picture frame, snapped it to the jig, and ran it through the blade. I just continued to rotate the frame until all four corners of the frame were cut. I glued in the splines, and here's a picture of the splines all sanded and cleaned up. I swapped the jig to the tenon side and threw a piece of 3/4 inch stock on there. The handle feels like I have a lot of control over the jig, and it's nice to have a dedicated area to hold on to it. Now, I won't be able to use the toggle clamp on thicker stock, but a secondary clamp, no problem. The toggle clamp slides completely out of the way, and you can get some tenons cut on bigger stock. By simply adding a second toggle clamp, this jig can be used to cut small raised panels. I didn't want to start putting holes into the jig at this point, so I attached the toggle clamp to a piece of plywood and clamped it all down. I made sure the blade would clear the toggle clamp and set my table saw to 15 degrees and then ran all 4 sides through the blade. Well, obviously you can cut bigger raised panels than this one here. This was just a quick example. I do have plans for future projects where I'll be using this jig to make bigger raised panels. Overall, I'm really happy with it. It works great. It does everything I need it to do. And it was not a difficult build. If this is your first time here, I hope I've earned your subscription. If I did, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. If you're already a subscriber, I appreciate the support. And we'll see you on the next one, guys.